man was walking in the woods one day when he saw a bear out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, said a silent prayer. God, I know you can do all things. Will you please make this bear a fellow Christian? The bear caught up to the man, placed his paw on the man's shoulder, and said, Brother, will you pray with me? Dear God, for this meal that I am about to receive, make me truly thankful. This is The Christian Bear with Dr. Ben Hilsman. Welcome to episode 36 of The Christian Bear. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Hilskamp. On this episode of The Christian Bear, we welcome Mr. Jeff Barker to the podcast. Jeff is an author, creative, coach, and higher education professional. In his professional life, he works in higher education, specifically in federal compliance, and as an administrator for software solutions and developing long-term strategies. Outside of formal work, he's a work-life balance coach, focusing on redefining life outside of work through physical, financial, and mental health. He writes about his daily journey on Twitter at the Jeff Barker. I will put his Twitter handle in the description below. Again, it's a great pleasure to welcome Jeff to the podcast. So again, Jeff, thank you for being on the Christian Bear today. I wonder if you can get us started with what I've been calling the quote-unquote easy question. What do you believe?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Ben. It's, beliefs are really an interesting concept, I think. I actually grew up as a United Methodist here in the U.S. And that was pretty much the Sunday routine. Like that was what we did. That's where we went. We went to church, sometimes stayed after, and then it was off to breakfast. And then when I was a teenager, I ended up getting to a point where I joined a youth group that really talked about salvation and how do you get saved, so to say. That definitely comes more from the evangelical realm. And I dove headfirst into that for a while. And throughout all of this, I was really starting to uncover different parts of me. And one of the big ones that definitely started to kind of rear its head was my sexuality. And so it really played a very interesting role because as a now confident gay man, it was difficult growing up with my religion because everything that I was taught from this youth group, and including when I went to college, to undergrad, and found people there that I connected with who were also born again Christians, as the new terminology that I had for it. It was always this: it's not possible to like other men and be Christian. And so I struggled a lot with going through how do we actually balance these two very different parts of me. I became heavily involved when I was in college. The typical rundown of my week was Sunday morning service, Monday night cell group, Tuesday night Bible study, Wednesday night life group, Thursday night Bible study, Friday night InterVarsity Christian fellowship group, and Saturday was probably the only day I didn't really have anything. So I was very heavily involved. I got quite far into leadership. I was I don't remember the word for it now, but one of the I guess the closest I can think of is a counselor at a Christian retreat. one of the leaders that would be there to actually sit and pray with someone and work through struggles with them. Um, and the whole time struggling with, how do I reconcile these two parts of my identity? Like, how do I reconcile who I am, or in this case, at this point in time, who I don't want to be, with the beliefs that I have been raised in and had kind of settled into. Um, and Eventually, what happened is I started questioning some of the beliefs, and not in a bad way, but just saying, if we as Christians were all following the same Bible, how come, and the same Jesus, how come there are so many different denominations that came out of it? Um, and so I started asking questions and started really reading for myself, and I found a lot of different authors. I remember The Shack was one of the books that really came up pretty quickly to me. When I started kind of looking at things on my own, it started to open me a bit to a different way of thinking about belief. And in this case, thinking about Christianity. I know that I found Frank Viola. He had a handful of books. There was another one, Leonard Sweet, I think was his name. He had another book. And so I started diving into a lot of different, I guess, more contemporary authors. And as I started exploring for myself a bit more, I started having leadership positions that I had moved into as like the head of the Bible study group that my roommate and I ran in college, or the person who is kind of the counselor figure at conferences. Those started kind of just being gently taken away, and kind of with the impression of, no, you're asking too many questions. Um, and so, I ended up moving away from kind of those core beliefs that I had grown up with. And what's been really interesting the past few years is trying to find, as a young adult who's now working in professional roles, trying to find what is it that I actually do believe. Um, because I've recognized that I don't believe in a lot of the things that I was raised with. And so it's been really interesting over the past few years trying to uncover, if I don't believe the same way I did in God and Jesus and all that comes from Christianity, all the good and bad that comes from Christianity, what is it that I actually do believe then? Um, so there's been a lot of really interesting exploration. One of the most recent ones has been, and when I say recent, I mean like week and a half, has been Stoicism. So there's definitely a lot of interesting components that I've been picking up here and there, from the Stoics. I've also had moments where I've kind of dabbled in the idea of what are the tenets of Buddhism and how does that look like in living out in a life. And I mean, I think at this moment, after having gone through all the beliefs that I was raised with, through, there are certain things that you do that are sins. Jesus died for our sins so that way we can get to heaven and we don't go to hell. And going through all of that from the Methodist lens to the evangelical lens, I it's been it's been a journey, especially as we're trying I'm trying to really work through what is my belief system. And I think where I've kind of wound up, as of right now at least, has been this idea of I'm here to live a peaceful life, a good life, and to basically bring love to others. And where that goes, that all changes. I mean, the universe, the one saying that I think I've come back to most consistently, and it's hard to kind of describe what it really means, but it's the idea of life will out. For me, at least, where that stems from is life is going to happen, and really your job is to figure out, how are you going to react to what happens? How are you going to make choices in your life and the decisions that you make and move forward in? But yeah, it's a very it's a very difficult journey to take when you're a young adult who kind of has this background, and then suddenly you're like, this doesn't really fit anymore. Like my image of what life is doesn't really fit what I was raised with. How do you really move into what you actually believe in?
Definitely. Thank you. I wonder, and perhaps I'm projecting a little bit too much here, but I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about um, your identity, your role as an author, and if that um, has had any effect, has had any part of your changing beliefs and your wrestling with belief.
Yeah. So I mean, I've kind of gone back and forth with writing. I started writing when I was in high school, mainly Saturday mornings, at the bowling alley, because I was in the 8 a.m. bowling league. My brother and sister were in the 10 a.m. bowling league, and I couldn't leave until they were done. So that really, I think, stemmed a lot of some of the exploration that comes with beliefs. Because as an author, even though I've only published one book, self-published one book, way back in mm, 2014, I think. Um, I spent a lot of time living in that world that I created, living with those characters. And really, one of the more interesting components of writing, whether you're or well, not writing per se, one of the more interesting components of characters, whether writing as an author or acting or anything like that, is you're having to develop or take on beliefs that you may not hold. And so I think that writing in general, even if it's anything beyond, writing novels, I've shifted a lot. More recently, I've started writing atomic essays on Twitter that have a very different focus, very different shift in focus from just writing characters. Um, but you have to, in writing, be able to step into different people's lives that are not yours. And so you're really taking a lot of time to dig in to beliefs and, well, why did this character respond this way, like truly, and not just, oh, it worked for the story. Don't get me wrong, there are times where, yep, it worked for the story is great. That's what we do. But often if we want to make three-dimensional characters, or if you're a copywriter and you want to write copy that makes sales, you have to be able to understand the motivations of other people. And you have to be able to make decisions based on belief systems that may not be yours. Um, and I think that causes you to challenge your own beliefs a lot without you really knowing that that's what you're doing. Um, so, I mean, for me, definitely that's certainly had an impact, I think, on beliefs. And especially with recent writings, it's taking steps in different directions. Why is it, for example, one of my goals is to retire early. Why is it that I want to? What is that really getting me? Um, and it a lot of it comes back to, well, why do I want to retire early? But yeah, I mean, writing though in general it's going to challenge your beliefs, and it's going to force you to question your own and also understand what other people's motivations are.
Thank you. So, when you think back over the last, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 years, since you've really been wrestling with these beliefs that you had as a young person, then into college, um, has anything made you question your beliefs? Particularly some of these newer beliefs for you, and did those change? Did those beliefs change? Did they evolve? Could you speak a little bit more to that?
Um, yeah, so my beliefs have definitely changed even as I've been learning and exploring the new areas that I find interesting. Um, it was it's not to say that I felt like I was adrift without the beliefs I had in Christianity as a child growing up, but there certainly ends up being a moment where you kind of have to wrestle with, okay, well, then where do these internal, like, you have to wrestle with, how do we answer these eternal questions of, morality, things like that. We really do. And I think reaction the best response to some of those questions came from Penn and Teller, but the Penn half, and I can't remember his name, but I just remember seeing this image and gift set where basically he says, you know, when we consider God, we don't necessarily need to consider God all the time. And his main rationality behind this came from the morality argument. So, as I'm sure most people who are listening know, morality is deemed to come from God, and that's how we've inherited our moral compass from God, and that He really helps us to understand, the right and wrong things to do. And the argument that came from Penn Penn and Teller was essentially, we don't need that. And here's why. I've raped all the number of people that I wanted to rape today, which was 0 people. And, initially I had kind of the gut reaction of just like, this is a little harsh. Like, that's a little blunt and on the nose, if you will, a little too much. But the more I was thinking about it, the more I was like, no, actually, the argument kind of makes sense. Like, if we think about all of these immoral things that could happen, even with God existing, they could still happen. And it's always been an interesting dynamic when it comes to that. And I definitely want to make sure that you ask me about it if I forget to talk about it. But the fact that no matter how something happens, it was always in God's plan. And so it's a very interesting conversation, but I want to stick with this train of thought a little bit longer. Um, the idea that morality is only based on a book that's been interpreted and reinterpreted many times, and had new words introduced into the lexicon of the book that didn't exist in the original language of Greek or Hebrew. It led me a lot to question how much of this is actually inspired by God, and how much of this is inspired by the individuals who were in power and charge at the time. Um, it's a tough question to deal with. Um, but that really challenged a lot of my beliefs, because one of the key things in terms of how I was really kind of trying to wrestle with my beliefs as a born again Christian, and trying to build it together with my sexuality, being attracted to men, um, was just the simple fact that it's a straight up, well, no, the Bible says that you can't be gay, or some level of interpretation for that, and multiple times. But the more I started to look into it, the more I was just like, well, there's one interesting story, and I will fully admit it's been a very long time since I've gone to any sort of religious service, so my names are escaping me. But there is a story where uh, King Saul, David and Jonathan, that's the name. So David and Jonathan are supposedly like best buddies. They're like they have the what's the word, bromance of the century, if you will. And I don't recall, but I think that David is set to go out to battle, and Jonathan essentially gives him his set of armor, or it's something in that vein. One, David or Jonathan essentially gives the other like their set of armor or something to that effect. And it seems like you might have an idea of where I'm going with this. So it's possible it's already been talked about, but I always found it interesting of, the idea of, well, if it was Jessica instead of Jonathan, it wouldn't be talked about as they were best friends, the closest brothers anybody could have. It would be talked about as if it was a true romance between the two of them. And so that story alone started to kind of lead me down an interesting path that, again, people that I was talking to about it were kind of like, I think you might have your interpretation off a little bit. And slowly you would start to see those little positions of power and authority kind of just being slowly pulled away, because it was breaking down the narrative that existed of being gay and being a Christian is wrong, not possible, a sin, what have you. Um, you know, still have I still have a person who I was good friends with in high school, who I shared a lot of these internal struggles with, trying to build, my beliefs and my religion together, or my beliefs and my sexuality together. And they still reach out every once in a while saying, I'm still praying that you'll be able to figure this out. And I, on one hand, I'm like, I appreciate that you think about me every once in a while. On the other hand, I'm like, it's been 10 years. Pretty sure that we've kind of settled on how this is going to work. Um, but, and I mean, I remember that one of our last conversations just kind of settles on, with her saying, I don't understand how this works. And because I don't, like, I can't support you in this. And whether good or not, it very much became my beliefs to say or not say, because I didn't reply, if you can't support me in this, then I I can't have you in my life, because I need people in my life who are going to understand the questions that I'm asking, or at least be open to exploring them more. Or when I've made a decision, be understanding to say, okay, okay.
Yes, when you mentioned David and Jonathan, yes, that's definitely something. I'm
Mm,
not sure if we've discussed. It's come up on the podcast yet, but I would argue that it's the closest thing we have in the Bible to a same-sex relationship slash marriage.
mm,
I mean, the scripture in question, and I don't know the chapter and verse, but actually uses the words in one translation, their souls were
Yeah.
knit together. Personally, and I'm sure a lot of people would be angry at me for saying this, but I don't know how that doesn't reflect marriage language.
Right.
Or at least betrothal language, perhaps. Um, but of course, I'm sure you can interpret it 100 different ways.
Exactly.
Um, and
Exactly.
I don't want to get lost on that scripture passage. Um, so, Jeff, if you had
Yeah.
to boil down your beliefs to one or two kind of core fundamental beliefs, what would they be?
Um, so I think if I really had to boil them down right now as it stands, um, I think it's three things. One, I continue to stick by this idea that life will out. Life is going to happen. You get to, you don't get to control what happens to you per se, but you do get to control how you react to it. Um, the second thing that I would say is, um, and now I'm blinking, which is not helpful because I had all three lined up in my head. Um, the Let me think for a moment.
One of them wasn't. You asked me to write down something about God making things happen.
Yeah, it wasn't that. Um, Life will out. Oh, yes. Okay. So yeah, one of them is definitely going to be that life will out. The other big one that I really come back to a lot recently is you're going to die, and you need to live accordingly. We our time on this earth, no matter what your belief system is limited. There is a end point. And when there isn't, then I think that's a whole nother suite of problems that will come up from that, but that's a totally different topic of conversation. Um, but yeah, you will die. And so you need to live your life according to that, knowing that, it could be this afternoon, it could be tomorrow, it could be in 50, 60 years, but it's going to happen. It's the one guarantee. And so live your life accordingly, because there are too many people, myself included, for a while, and I'm really working on, pushing through that, um, who just, they get up, they have the same thing, they go to work or they go to school, and then they go home and they maybe do a couple of things, then they go to bed and they do it all again the next day. And, it's not to say that life is not made up of ordinary moments that are extraordinary, but there is something to say of, you need to work towards designing the life you want to live, and not just living and doing for the sake of living and doing. um I would say there was a third one, it's escaped me, but those I would say are probably the two that I have. Life will out and you're going to die, so live accordingly.
Thank you. So I always like to give a little bit of time at the end of the podcast for anything that you might want to promote, anything else you may want to talk about, any thoughts we didn't get to that you definitely wanted to include today. So really, kind of the floor is yours.
Hmm. Yeah. So, well, I would say probably the biggest thing that I'm really working on is living life. And when I say that, what I'm alluding to is working towards intentionally designing my life in different areas that I want to truly hone in and focus on. So that way I can, when I reach my deathbed, I can look back and say, I don't regret a single thing that happened, that I did, that I didn't do, whatnot. Um, so to that end, my most recent work that I've been doing, actually, I think you might actually be the first I'm really telling about it, has been, starting a Twitter account. So it's real interesting. I'm not going to sit here and say that I understand Twitter, but I'm doing the important thing and showing up every day because I said that I would, and being consistent. And my focus there is really on three core areas of my life: um, my financial health, my physical health, and my mental health. And so I've really identified those three areas as the core pieces I want to really hone in on, to be able to, one, retire early, and be able to probably pretty much operate what my dream would be, which is a bookstore slash coffee shop slash lounge type space in an old abandoned warehouse that's been refurbished. It's called the living room. It's got plants and giant windows. It's great. Um, but I'm realizing that, like I said, I will die. And so I'm starting to truly and intentionally take steps to develop a life that I'm excited to wake up for every morning, and not just waking up and saying, okay, well, it's Wednesday, 2 more days of work this week, and actually excited to say, no, like, it's Wednesday. We're going to do some stuff today and it's going to be great. Um, so that's probably the biggest project, that I've really been working on most recently. Uh, I'm hoping to eventually develop it into something a little bit more. I'm wanting to venture a little bit into the ideas behind meditation, journaling, to really get everything out of your head into the universe, onto paper, so that way your head is there, um, for you to use how you want, according to how you want, etc. And then I'm doing it specifically because, as you know, as a former colleague, I was very much a workaholic, and I'm calling myself a recovering workaholic, and really making conscious efforts to not be at work all the time, and being here when I have to. Like, for example, we have an inauguration of our college president coming up this weekend, so I know I'm going to be working the weekend, but I'm doing everything I can to have those boundaries in place to make sure that my life isn't dedicated to my work. Um, that may be another belief that you could add. You really should work to live, not live to work. Um, so yeah, that would be the floor that I would have to share. If people are interested, they can find me on Twitter, at the Jeff Barker, um, and I think I'm on Instagram with the same thing. I don't know. I've tried to like centralize all the usernames that I can to make it easy, but yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate you being on the show today, Jeff. And I look forward to our listeners having the chance to hear your thoughts. Thank you again to Jeff Barker for joining us on this episode of The Christian Bear. I will put links to all of Jeff's social media in the episode description for this episode. This has been The Christian Bear with Dr. Ben Hilsky.